Turning here to United States and here in Washington, where thousands of Americans commemorated the 50th anniversary of the nation's largest ever civil rights march. The central figure, Martin Luther King Jr., was remembered for his enduring "I Have a Dream" speech. VOA's Carolyn Prasuti explains why Americans gathered this year to hear the nation's most prominent African American give a speech at the same location.
Half a century ago, 250,000 people marched in Washington, D.C. for jobs and freedom. It was a day that would change the course of a nation. Thousands did the same Wednesday to commemorate the date. In 1963, they stood along the reflecting pool, facing the Lincoln Memorial, to hear speakers like Martin Luther King Jr. talk of civil rights for blacks. Wednesday, in 2013, they heard the words of King's descendants, two former presidents, and the nation's first black president.
Because they marched, America changed for you and for me. And the entire world drew strength from that example.
The man at the center of that example 50 years ago was the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. The March on Washington and King's iconic "I Have a Dream" speech was the motivation for changes of attitudes and laws. It led to the Civil Rights Act the following year that outlawed discrimination, and the Voters' Rights Act a year later.
This must become true, so let freedom ring.
At the same time that King delivered those words 50 years ago, the King family heirs rang a bell that joined bells across the country. The bell had symbolism, too. It survived a bombing of a Southern black church just 2 weeks after the King's speech. 4 young girls died. Speakers said the bell tolled now for a recommitment to King's dream. Kevin Williams has lived through these changing times. He is 52 years old.
So that means that I was born in 1961. 100 years before that, the Civil War started. Right? And at 2 years old, this wonderful speech occurred. I wasn't aware then, but at 52 now, I'm looking at the benefits for everyone that the first 50 years made, and I'm trying to dedicate myself to the next 50.
Bill Clinton.
Former President Bill Clinton urged the crowd to action.
It is time to stop complaining and put our shoulders against the stubborn gates holding the American people back.
That challenge is now up to the young, who learn about anti-discrimination laws in textbooks, like Kiera Williams, who spent 10 hours on a bus to be here.
It's also a start of our generation, my generation. It's time for us to continue the legacy because the struggle still continues, so that's why I'm here.
President Obama said while much progress has been made, the civil rights struggle has unfinished business in economic equality, asking, what good is it to sit at the same lunch counter when you cannot afford the lunch? Carolyn Prasuti, VOA News, Washington.
Well, for more perspective, we are now joined by Emira Woods, co-director of Foreign Policy in Focus at the Institute for Policy Studies here in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for being here today, Emira.
Always an honor.
So what is your appreciation of the significance of what happened yesterday? Of course, there was a march on Saturday, too, but 50 years after that momentous occasion.
Well, it's been a week of commemorations, commemorating this march for justice and jobs. And I think the underlining point is that 50 years later, we've accomplished a lot. You know, we got to see yesterday the historic African-American president of the United States make a speech on that spot, which is exciting. But we also recognize that there's still a long ways to go when we think about both jobs and justice in the United States and also around the world today. So the issues that brought people out this week, both the march Saturday and the march on the 28th yesterday, was really unemployment. You know, understanding that particularly black and brown communities are devastated by lack of employment opportunities. So, you know, unemployment rate 14%. For African Americans, double the national rate here in the United States. And in some cities for African American males in New York, it's as high as almost 50% unemployment. So you still have very real concerns in terms of equality here in the United States.
And then, of course, that in the backdrop of, the voters' rights bill recently
Without a
that the
doubt.
Supreme Court did, and
Yes.
the permission for the New York police to stop and frisk and literally shake down people. So many are asking, so 50 years on, a lot has been accomplished, but then what is still outstanding? Should it be? And how does it change at this point, especially when you look at policymakers out of 435, there are only about less than 50, including the Senate. Who's going to change it? What does it take?
Well, there is a lot to be done. Clearly, the issues that brought people to the table this week around mass incarceration, African-American males, again, outstrip all other communities in terms of the rate of imprisonment here in the United States, often for very minor infractions, often drug-related crimes, very minor infractions. You also have issues of education, schools closing. Places like here, Washington, D.C. or Chicago, public schools are really being decimated. Schools closing when people need education much more than anything to advance. So there is a concern.
What does
well,
one do?
the solution is organizing. As what happened 50 years ago.
Right.
A lot of attention is on Martin Luther King, but it was A. Philip Randolph heading the trade union movements, the labor movements, bringing workers to the fore. It was people like Bayard Rustin, African-American Gale man in the 60s, organizing based on a
Medgar
different
Evers, who died
Medgar
just
Evers,
shortly before the march.
you had women who didn't have the platform necessarily on the stage that they should have had, but were very much central in the organizing efforts. It was movements then, and it's movements now that will be needed to bring a change in the status quo.
Now, the late Reverend King said complacency, also hatred, are the death of democracy and the fight for civil rights movement. You keep hearing a lot about this complacency, especially among some young people. What do you think?
Well, I think people talk a lot about the complacency, but we saw on Saturday it was over 200,000 people. Some say 300,000 people gathered on the mall.
But people are dropping out. Young African American males are dropping out of college. They're not employed. So when you put it, yes, showing up is one thing, but what about what is being done day to day to sustain the movement?
Yeah. Well, I think it is always a struggle, but I think we have to recognize it is young people that are leading movements in the U.S. and around the world. The Occupy movement that took us by a storm changed the public discourse to issues of inequality, understanding the role of the elite, the 1% versus the 99%, not only in the U.S. but around the world. It is young people in places like Egypt or Tunisia or all of the places, Nairobi, that organized under the banner of Occupy Nairobi, right? I mean, 22 African countries where young people, together with trade unions and opposition leaders and hip-hop artists, culture workers, they led a movement and are still leading these movements for change.
Like President Obama said yesterday, the march is happening, it's just in different ways. Thank you so much.
It's
Emira
a pleasure.
Woods,
Thank you.
Co-Director of Foreign Policy and Focus at the Institute for Policy Studies, joining us